Gun to your head, what's the most important aspect of a fighting game? Now take your time, a lot of different answers may have popped up in all of our heads. It could be general gameplay, presentation, accessibility, online functionality is a hot button topic recently. Existing is pretty critical. Forget all that bullshit, you 2014's Dumb and Dumber 2, it's obviously the characters. It's the main thing that highlights the strength of the genre when compared to anything else in the video game industry. Though I guess all the other stuff is nice too. There's admittedly a lot of ingredients that make a good fisticuff stew, but I think it'd be a little disingenuous if we acted like the characters and roster weren't a major part of it. There's very little else to focus on in a fighting game besides the 2 characters in front of you, or the 4, or the 6, or the 32 if my competitive Tekken Force revival ever gets to Harada's desk. The characters you choose matter because they will dictate how the game feels and functions as long as you play them. You become attached to these characters, sometimes for gameplay reasons, sometimes for other reasons, sometimes for the right reasons. A lot of the time, they become what you associate the most with the game, and depending on the character's popularity, many others would be in the same boat. So what happens when a long-running franchise decides to mix things up for the roster that's already present, to introduce a batch of fresh, young faces while taking the old characters out to pasture like a delay-based old yeller? The bullet'll hit just gonna take 8 to 12 frames after you pull the trigger. New characters are a loaded topic, from mild annoyances to exciting new prospects to nearly sinking the largest fighting game franchise in video game history. There's a lot here, so let's start nice and easy. What is a new generation? While the actual phrase was coined by a game we'll get to in a little bit, trust me, we'll definitely get to it, it's used to signify a new character or multiple new characters designed to replace or evolve an already established member of the roster. No role or archetype is safe from this. From joke characters to protagonist to main rival, the new generation can touch every corner of a franchise. When this happens, 3 main questions come to mind. How do they differ from the original character? What do they borrow from them? And is the original character still in the roster? The third question is pretty straightforward. Just look at the character select screen. Are they there? No? That's right. That's what you get for being an El Fuerte main. But those first 2 questions can be a little more complicated. How much is entirely new, and what aspects of the character do they inherit? And that is, if anything is inherited at all. The line between emulation of the old and implementation of the new is tread in different degrees by different developers. The only real answer is to look at the characters on a case-by-case basis, breaking down what works, what doesn't, and who actually stuck around when it was all said and done. We'll start off with something relatively low-key, but a firm reminder of just how south something like this can go. Soulcalibur V, an installment of another 3D fighting game franchise that everyone says they want to succeed, but no one actually buys unless it says TotalKI, was released in January of 2012, and introduced the first big shakeup in terms of the core roster. And yes, I'm saying that in a series that did include Link, Heihachi, Spawn, Cosmos, Lloyd Irving, Yoda, Starkiller, and Darth Vader all in some fashion. Still waiting for that time shift crossover. Come on, Bamco, get on it. The difference here was that instead of looking for guest characters to be the main spice in this next Soulcalibur dish, though Assassin's Creed's Ezio Auditore was included, they took it a step further and slapped some new, freshly moisturized baby faces on direct replacements of classic characters, and positioned them to be the next main roster. This included siblings Patroklos and Pyrrha, who, since being related to these two, borrow from Cassandra and Sophidia, with Alpha Patroklos, a form Patroklos takes while using the Soulcalibur, using Setsuka's moveset. Natsu is a student of the series veteran Taki, Yan Leija replaces Yang Hua, and Jiba stands in for Killik. Kinda. Killick's in the game just as one of those mimic characters that randomly chooses an existing moveset when you pick him, alongside Elysium and Edgemaster. Be careful of the search bar when looking up that last name, by the way. While many veterans remained, Siegfried, Nightmare, Mitsurugi, Ivy, Tira, and Cervantes, to name a few. It was clear the new kids on the block were who the marketing and story tried to thrust into the spotlight. Issue was that the new cast had all the original charm of a cinder block. It also didn't help that the story included the new protagonist, Patroclus. It didn't help that the story included the new protagonist, Patroclus, killing innocent civilians while exuding posh fantasy Brit energy at every conceivable moment. While on the topic of the poster child for 5, like many of his freshman class in relation to classic characters, Patroclus legit just took large chunks of Cassandra's, Sophia's, and Setsuka's movesets, effectively neutering any discussion of those characters returning as DLC for Soulcalibur V. It got so bad for our boy Patroclus that in a Soulcalibur character popularity poll taken in 2015, out of 45 characters, his original and alpha forms ranked at 37 and 38 respectively. His friends didn't fare all that well either, with no new character introduced in 5 breaking the top 20. To avoid beating around the Edgemaster bush, the results show that this new roster was not great. The new cast was either so interchangeable with their origin character in both personality and gameplay that it was questionable why they existed in the first place, or their new traits were so unappealing that the roster slot would have been better served empty. Or, and hear me out here, been filled by the character that was already there and basically did the same thing. This whole kerfuffle likely contributed to Soulcalibur 6's only new characters being Grow and Aswell. And though there are the choice few who will champion 5's completely new characters like Zwei and Viola, the new Soulcalibur 5 roster to many is best left in Soulcalibur 5. Running this through my flawless review system, I give it 2 Sanford Kellys out of 5. Too many shoulder lions, not enough cute fortune teller girls or himbo stand users. On the flip side, a series that regularly dabbles in introducing new characters is The King of Fighters by SNK. While preceded by the likes of Art of Fighting and Fatal Fury, KOF is SNK's premier fighting game franchise, with KOF 15 coming later this year. KOF's form of the new generation comes into play with its sagas, a series of story arcs which each cover a certain number of KOF games. The only exceptions to this trend are the first installment, KOF 94, which is considered a prologue, and the Dream Match games, which include non-canon events and characters. The Orochi saga, covering KOFs 95 to 97, more thoroughly established what would be the franchise's main poster family: Kyo Kusanagi, Benimaru, Goro Daimon, Iori Yagami, alongside a slew of in-house IP representatives like Psycho Soldiers Athena Asamiya and the Ikari Warriors team. While not all originating from KOF, they quickly became staples of the franchise and have since become more iconic and recognized as veteran KOF characters than as guests from other IPs under SNK's umbrella. My sincerest apologies to all 3 Psycho Soldier fans. KOF's yearly releases meant that a lot had to be shaken up between the roster, presentation, and gameplay with each installment to avoid the series becoming stale. So, after 3 games covering the Orochi saga and a Dream Match game in KOF 98, SNK shifted gears into what would be called the Nest Chronicles, covering KOFs 99 to 2001, and, relevant to our discussion, focused on a secret organization making literal clones of the series protagonist, Kyo Kusanagi. From this cloning process came the new protagonist, K-Dash, named as such because he's Kyo, and he likes to dash a lot. Alongside him is Maxima, big dude, metal fist, hype beam, you get the gist. And though she didn't have a proper playable appearance until KOF 2001, and didn't even join K-Dash's team until KOF 11, the wildly popular Kula Diamond is now commonly associated with K-Dash and Maxima, even though the third spot on this hero team was essentially a revolving door, including the likes of Benimaru and Whip until settling on Kula. And so you may be asking, since K-Dash was being pushed in KOF 99 as the face of this saga, where were characters like Kyo and Iori? Well, like the extended family that you only briefly interact with at social gatherings, they're technically present, but they're just not paid too much mind. Kyo and Iori separately enter the tournament as single entrants, and only appear as hidden characters in the arcade version of 99. This would continue in KOF 2000 before the pair returned to the usual 3-man formula for 2001 and 2002. Speaking of the boy, K-Dash himself played quite differently from Kyo, being a bit more well-rounded and mobile compared to Mr. Bodega. And though Kyo was relegated to a secret character with a new redesign, his old sprite assets technically carried over. Remember when I said K-Dash was a clone of Kyo? Well, they obviously didn't think one was enough. Overnight, every Japanese citizen apparently got a stimulus package from the government with Kyo Kusanagi's blood, because this motherfucker was everywhere. These stunning examples of creativity come in the forms of Kyo 1, Kyo 2, Kusanagi, Chrysalid, and K9999, or shortened to K49. Chrysalid and K49 only really had connections to Kyo through the lore and not really gameplay. Kyo 1, Kyo 2, and Kusanagi, however, as you can probably tell by the names, are essentially in-universe justification for carrying over Kyo's likeness and moveset from the Orochi saga, while still allowing K-Dash to take the main spotlight from 99 to 02. Fast forward to 2003 and we come to the Tales of Ash, introducing a new main character in Ash Crimson. There's a little less to be said about this saga than the Nest Chronicles, since Kyo and Iori just became single entrants again for the first few games to let Ash properly settle in. Ash himself doesn't really play like Kyo or Iori, and with K-Dash now a solidified member of the roster, you can see how KOF didn't make a habit of really ever dropping people that were core to the franchise's identity. The only real exception being Ash's absence in KOF 14, which was for both plot reasons and to let yet another new hero shine in the form of Shun'ei, though his half-pant leg rolled up ass is pretty polarizing at the moment. Overall though, it's cool to see so many classic characters persevere through the ages while still giving enough room for the new generation to settle with its audience. I give KOF 5 IFC Yipes out of 5. Gimme back my charge motion fanboy. Thank you. Oh boy, we finally got here. He's about to say the name of the video. Street Fighter III New Generation released in February 1997, and though Street Fighter III's final iteration, Third Strike, has become one of the most lauded and celebrated fighting games of all time, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows at the start of SF3's history. Street Fighter II's original release was back in 1991, and was maybe kinda sorta successful. I don't know, seems kinda niche if I'm being honest. I certainly never heard of it. Despite its low-key nature, Street Fighter wasn't entirely dormant in that 6-year gap, with Street Fighter Alpha, or Street Fighter Zero in Japan, releasing in 1995. Street Fighter 3, however, was important. Not just because 3 is bigger than 2, and probably bigger than Alpha, but because it showed exactly what the next step of the franchise would be. The Alpha series enjoyed great amounts of success, no doubt, but focused on the time frame before Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter 3 would be a prime example of the future of not only the series, but potentially fighting games as a genre. For better or for worse, Capcom was so certain of the appeal that the arcade marquees that went on the cabinet and were meant to market the game just had the Roman numeral 3 on it. Didn't say what it was, didn't even say Street Fighter, it just said 3. So you take that obviously powerful brand recognition of Street Fighter, you take the new, beautiful graphics of the then cutting-edge CPS3 arcade board, you take a healthy era of arcade fighting games, and you take a roster that features some of the most recognizable video game characters, period. You set the stove to high, you stir all that up, and out comes an oddly stealth release with little fanfare and mediocre financial results. But wait, how is that possible? I hear you cry. It was all there. Everything was set up for this to be a smash hit. How did this stumble of all times in the late 90s? Well, many reasons, though surprisingly, none really came from the quality of the characters that were introduced in New Generation. No, the actual roster, both back then and especially now, make up some of Street Fighter's finest, like Alex, Ibuki, Elena, and Dudley. Its shortcomings in the market in which it released pertained more to what surrounded the game and what it otherwise lacked. And don't worry, I'll touch on said roster fully in just a moment. You see, in 1997, Capcom had plenty of competition from the likes of SNK, Midway, Namco, Sega, and many others. The genre was no longer an untapped well of potential like it was in 1992, but what added on to this natural competition was Capcom's competition with itself. In 1996 alone, the year directly before New Generation released in arcades, the company let loose Star Gladiator, Red Earth, Street Fighter EX, Street Fighter Alpha 2, and X-Men vs. Street Fighter. When 97 rolled around, alongside Street Fighter 3 was Pocket Fighter, Rival Schools, Vampire Savior 1 and 2, yes both of them, and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. While it's heartwarming to see so many diverse franchises be given so much love in such a short amount of time, a recipe for guaranteed financial success with every title, this was not. That leads us to our next point. Street Fighter kept chugging along regardless, with 2 ongoing series in Alpha and EX, along with a shit ton of crossover appearances. It would make sense to assume Street Fighter 3 was set in stone from the start of production. Well, as it turns out, this was not the case, as New Generation and presumably the characters within it were not meant to be Street Fighter 3 or even associated with Street Fighter at all until later into development. This change was brought in part due to the weak sales numbers of Capcom fighting game IPs that weren't Street Fighter, like Darkstalkers, Cyberbots, and Star Gladiator. Now, with that particular fact in mind, who do you think returned from Street Fighter 2 into New Generation? Ding ding ding, it was damn near nobody. Ryu was the only planned returning fighter once development properly shifted gears, with Ken added in later to fill up the roster since he was so easy to adapt from the existing Ryu assets. There's even rumors of an early prototype build that represented what would have been this brand new IP with no returning characters whatsoever. But like I said, it wasn't just the lack of veteran characters that made people indifferent. The Street Fighter crowd had been sated by Alpha and the Versus games for 2 to 3 years at that point, and other companies were only building up more and more momentum. Combine that with what I hesitate to call the game's marketing campaign of 3, and New Generation wound up being less than a smash hit financially in the arcades or in near future console ports. And that trend would continue through Second Impact in the same year and Third Strike in 1999. It would also contribute to the general fighting game drought that only turned around with the release of Street Fighter 4 in 2008. Like I mentioned earlier though, time has been incredibly kind to Street Fighter 3, and its later character additions like Urien, Makoto, and Q only added to what would become one of Street Fighter's most celebrated eras. In Third Strike, the only returning characters from 2 ended up being Ryu, Ken, Akuma, and Chun-Li, and that game, now that it's been given all this time to sit with the community, is constantly in the greatest of all time conversation for not just Street Fighter, but for fighting games in general. But due to multiple factors, it just didn't hold the same weight back in the late 90s. All these characters are super dope though, so it gets a strong 3K Braz out of 5. Maybe don't market your game as 3 next time. And I'd say that covers it. We've analyzed the lows, the highs, the creamy middles, and the tightrope act that is played with each and every adjustment to a fighting game's roster. Some leaned too heavily into the past, some found just the right spot, and some were 3. There's plenty of other high-profile cases of the New Generation, like BlazBlue with Central Fiction or Mortal Kombat with MKX, along with instances of outright ignorance to a character's importance like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. But I'll go ahead and leave it up to you guys if you'd like to see me cover them in a part 2 in the future. For now, it's time for me to leave you all with an insightful message about legacy. Don't neglect your old characters, let your new ideas breathe, and don't fuck it up. What? I'm not a professional, I just like fighting games. I'm the lowest type of life form there is. But in all seriousness, I think a lot can be gleaned from this in terms of what people are initially willing to accept, and how stubborn people can be to change for good or ill. However, there's a fine line from trying to showcase what the future holds, and casually tossing the series' heritage into the garbage bin. But it's a little full, but you're too lazy to fully change the bag, so you just gotta shove that shit in there. In my personal opinion, I've always been fond of how SNK handles their characters. characters, though they're in a unique position since they followed linear annual releases for nearly a decade straight, so each new character got not only multiple years, but multiple installments to fully settle with the crowd. On the other hand, were I to give a big fat stinky award, Soulcalibur V and its opulent lion shoulder would probably clean house in all categories. And the 3 award goes to Street Fighter 3! With that said, I believe that'll do it. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and like and subscribe to stay in the loop for all future content. I'm planning on releasing more fighting game content with the release of Guilty Gear Strive, and I'm currently running a Machinima series using Ace Combat and Project Wingman. So if that piques your interest, go ahead and give it a look. Y'all have a good one, and I'll check y'all later.